We don't plan to take too much of your evening. Hopefully we can have you back home a little over an hour or an hour and a half. We trust that in that time period we'll be able to have very fruitful discussions. My name is Moss Ntla. I'm chairman of the Defend Our Democracy organization, and I'm glad to be your host, not only for these discussions, but also hopefully to be able to share with my colleagues in relation to how we facilitate the discussions going forward. We gathered this evening really to look at, as you know, the real state of the nation. And now that, suppose that needs to be explained a little bit. We know that in 2 days' time, the President of the Republic will be presenting the State of the Nation, which is a tradition of ours in this country to do that at more or less at the beginning of every year, where the state president gives the nation a sort of status update about where we are as a society and what the accomplishments of the government have been and what it is that government plans to do with where we are at this point. And so that's been going on for quite a while now. And we have become sort of adults in the last 30 years as a society, and there's some things we've heard before, and there's built-in issues in our society which we believe very seldom get aired in the reading of our society by the political class. And so the state of the nation in that sense becomes a view of the political class about this society and how to fix the things that are going on in there. Now, the real state of the nation, as we've framed our evening, is really to give voice to the rest of the society in some way, to weigh in on what the state of the nation is, to weigh in on what ought to be the marching order of all of us in some way, in order to make our democracy a better democracy, to have it flourish, and to be able to do the best that we can be as a country. And so this will obviously be a take from outside of Parliament when the President speaks to the joint sitting on the 8th. And I have guests with me that will be helping us as we think through this. And they will be introduced as we go along by my colleague, Zakira, who will do that in a moment. But the idea is that the order will be firstly Dr. Padi Lehohla. As you know, all of you probably know him and have heard him speak. You've heard some of his thoughts on these issues. And he will kick off our discussion from our statistician general. And then there will be an economist who speaks at it from a different angle, Iraj Abedjian, who will give us an economic perspective on this. Then we'll have a more civil society weighing in on this, and that will be done by Janet Jobson in that order. And so I'm going to invite Zakira to unmute and to do a brief introduction to our speaker as he comes up. Welcome, Zakira.
Thanks, Reverend Moss, and thank you to everyone for joining us this evening. Today's event is really something that we've hosted traditionally in the last 2 years before the State of the Nation address. The previous 2 events were held in Cape Town at St. George's Cathedral. This year, we are diverting slightly from tradition by having the event online and also having a panel of speakers that will really be asked the question, what is the real state of the nation? That being said, I'd like to welcome our panelists, Iraj, Janet, and Pali. I will introduce each of them separately just before they come in with their inputs. So first, I'd like to call on Pali Lekgotla, who is the former statistician general in South Africa, and many will know him from our TV screens, but he's also the director of the Economic Modeling Academy, which aims to empower bureaucrats, civil society organizations, academia, and corporates. And this is really in the use and applications of policy engagements through the use of integrated web-based tools and economic scenario planning. He has studied at the University of Ghana. He's had, honorary doctorates from the University of Stellenbosch. He has also been the chair of the United Nations Statistics Commission, and has really been at the forefront of this kind of work throughout the continent. So welcome to you, Mr. Lekgotla, and over to you for your introductory input, and then we'll take the other two speakers.
Well, thank you very much. Let's start first by congratulating Bafana Bafana to have reached the stage, and hope that they will bring us more good news in the next few days. I am pleased to be with yourselves here at this moment in time when South Africa has had many forks in the road. This is not the first fork it has. There have been several of them, and we have almost lost count. And I think as we anticipate the State of the Nation address, we look at that. Well, is it a bated breath with a lot of anticipation or a lot of anxiety and desperation? It's all in the mix. To try and elaborate on some of the issues I've raised publicly in the press, I thought I would ground my initial contribution by sharing a screen that I found many a time helpful for me to try and ventilate that which I see, and that probably what we could try and understand or bring some understanding to ourselves as a nation. It doesn't have a title. Let me blow it up a bit. I've taken 2 minutes of my time. I want to start with this, which is the beginning of life. And the beginning of life happens in many ways. The normally known one is that there are fathers and there are mothers, and they are joined in matrimony. And in South Africa, it's the same issue, except that the fathers, 60% of the fathers, argue that they are legally married against 31% of the mothers. Therein lies the schizophrenia of filial relationships or conjugal rights that then extend to raising children and bringing life. So with this kind of disparity in the correspondence of the spouses, where fathers are twice as many as mothers that are married, it suggests that South Africa, if we agree with these statistics, that mothers are polygynous instead of polygamous in the case of fathers. And indeed, this schizophrenia reflects in us right through life. So if you think there is some joint, including living together, for fathers, that is 95% against mothers who actually are at 49%. So almost half the mothers are out of these arrangements that fathers say they are in. You can imagine how kind of life then as society we are leading. And the policy dimensions are thrust on this matrimonial bed that is so disjointed. And no doubt why we have continuous and unabating gender-based violence. Now, it's very important to look at this graph here. This graph reflects the number of people who have completed matric and start at a degree, and that is by race. This side is the percentage of each race, and this is across time. I just got data from the census 2022, and I would like to extend this to 2022 to see what is happening. But it's not that data here, but the trend is very obvious from as far back as 1975 and across time to about 2016. That trend, I doubt if it will change that much, because our education is in comatose, it's in an ICU. Now, if these graphs move up that way, then we are doing well. If the graphs move that way, down that way, it means we are not doing well. And we are going to observe this across race. So let's see what happens. So you can see that the white graph up there moves up, the colored graph and the black graph moves down over time. And indeed, it is not because these blacks and coloreds are stupid, but it is because at this point, the gradient is going up, as well as the gradient amount starts declining since about 1995. Then we see a terminal decline in the performance of blacks and coloreds in as far as they progress, having entered a university. The Indians, on the other hand, have done quite well. What happens is that at this point in time, the ratio of blacks for every white is one. For every one black that progresses, there are 6 whites that progress at this point in time here. As we progress here, or rather, for every one black, there are 1.2 whites. But when we come to this point in 2015, for every one black, there are 6 whites that progress, and there are 3 Indians that progress. Now, this is what our education has delivered, and this is happening to 90% of the population. This deplorable situation is happening to 90%, and signals of progress are shown amongst whites and Indians.
I think we're losing you, Dr. Padi. I don't know what's your network seems to be failing a little bit.
I think we will just stop, Mr. Leotla, we're going to stop your video just so that it can save on bandwidth, and then you can continue presenting. Let's just try that out. Okay, I'm going to ask the technical team from DoD just to see if Mr. Leotla could maybe come back on again to try and get him reconnected. But in the meanwhile, to those who have just joined in, welcome. We are currently just taking a presentation from Pali Leotla, who was just about disconnected a few minutes ago. And we are currently discussing what is called the real state of the nation, and really probing questions to do with the state of our democracy 30 years on, and whether we have failed in some of the challenges that this new democracy has posed to us. I think we could potentially go to our next speaker. Reverend Moss, is that okay with you?
Yeah, sure. Proceed, yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to ask Iraj Abidin to come on. Iraj is the founder and chairman of the Pan-African Capital Holdings Limited and the Pan-African Investment in Research Services, PTY Ltd. He is better known as, to all of us on our TV screens and day-to-day, as just simply being an economist. But I don't think there's anything really simple about being an economist, given the scale of the economic problems that the country is facing at the moment. He obtained his BA Honours and MA in Economics from the University of Cape Town, and he serves on a number of boards, has written a number of books, and just to note, he's on the board of the Institute for Security Studies. He's also an advisory board member at the Auditor General of the the Auditor General's Office of the South African Government, and that's from 2006 to date. So welcome to you, Iraj, and over to you for your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zakaria. And thank you very much for everybody to be here. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to share some thoughts. The real estate of the South African economy, in one sense, is a very sad reality. Sad in the sense that it's an economy that has all the natural resources and national resources to be able to be growing anywhere between 3.5% to 4.5% at the current environment that we are in globally. Of course, we are now degenerated to a growth of about 0.5% if we are lucky, and that is the sad part of it. It's an economy, many economies do not have the capacity, the potential to grow more than 1.5%, but our economy is distinctly different, even amongst the emerging economies. It has become a fragile economy. Often analysts, rating agencies, investors refer to the South African economy as an economy which is fragile. Fragile in the sense that its underpinnings of economic performance, the underlying variables that affects investment decisions, affects career decisions, affects the future prospects of welfare, are completely unreliable, and some nowadays would say hollowed out. And what are those underpinnings? It's about, first and foremost, is the capacity of the machinery of the state. No economy in economic history has ever managed to progress, to sustain its growth and social development without a capable machinery of the state. And here I'm not referring to the political, I'm not talking about the cabinet and the political structures, important as they are, but it is a machinery of the state. It's the capability of the municipalities, the capability of government departments, the professional manner in which policies are not just designed, but also implemented, and the care with which, the expertise with which those policies are assessed in order to fit and map onto this, the socio-political realities of our economy, of our society. In that sense, the real estate of the South African economy is a very sad one. It's a very unfortunate one. And of course, the fact that the political machinery that has been governing over the past 15 years, especially, in my view, has gone off the rail. Much of the damage to the underpinning of the economy has been done from the belly of the cabinet, which is very unusual. It is not about ideological policy mismanagement or policy misunderstanding or having specific wrong turns in policy. It's about consciously and in a coordinated manner, those who are entrusted to govern, they have become the destroyers of some of the assets of the country, be they Eskom, be they Transnet, be the machinery of the government. I mentioned the importance of the public sector infrastructure at all three spheres of national, provincial, and local government, and quite frankly, by the choice of people who have been appointed, by the policies that they have been employed, and by the plunder that has taken place in the daylight, and now it's no longer an accusation or a speculation. We have 5,500 pages of the Zondo Commission report, and that incidentally is only about 5 to 6% of the evidence. But from that 5 to 6% or 10% of the evidence, we as a nation know how those who were entrusted to govern, they have plundered and they have, in a way, handicapped us. So the real estate of this economy is that it's an economy that has been brought to its knees. And unless, from a national point of view, we come up with a campaign, with a design or policy to rescue it, there is nothing in this economy that can self-correct. I can come back later that in economic theory and economic modeling, it's quite clear that when an economy is broken to this level, there is nothing internal that it will self-correct. It requires external interventions, and we'll explore some of those in the next hour. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, go ahead, Zakira.
Sorry, Reverend Moss. So thanks for that input, Iraj. I see Pali is back on. Welcome back. And for those who have just joined on, Pali was speaking earlier. He's the former Statistician General of South Africa, but was disconnected. So welcome back to you, Pali, and you may proceed with the rest of your presentation.
Oh, no, thank you very much. I suppose I'd said something nasty. That's why I got dismounted. But thank you very much for bearing with me and allowing me to then continue on the slides and agree with Iraj that those we put in power are responsible for destroying this economy from in the last 15 years, destroying our social infrastructure as well as a shaky moral frame that I was just pointing in terms of what has happened at best. Now, here I was at the stage when I was comparing what was happening in 2008 and comparing that with what is happening in 2023, which is a period of about over a period of about 15 years. What has happened? Now, on this side of the graph, we are showing unemployment, and this side we are showing employment. And over here, we are looking at different age groups: 15 to 24, 25 to 34, 35 to 44, 45 to 54. The only group that is growing its employment are those who are 35 to 64. That's the only group in which we have seen growth in employment from 2008 to 2023. This dark purple here reflects that. This side is the level and degree of unemployment. It has grown for all age groups. But what is striking is that whereas in 2008, there were 4.8 million people who are aged 25 to 34 employed, which is up here. By 2023, which is 14, 15 years later, there were only 4.4 million, 400,000 less employed compared to them. Then here, it's even more disastrous. Whereas in 2008, there were 1.6 million young people employed, 15 to 24. Now it's only 1 million. So in a growing population of these age groups, we have had losses of people employed. Now, in a normal situation, surely when these young people who have lost their share in absolute numbers and share in proportionate numbers, and they look that it is only these adults that are getting jobs, they have to wish that they can be 35 to 44 as fast as possible so that they can get jobs. Now, the issue here around policy design is that the policy design in South Africa is so bad, absolutely so bad, that the politicians will be talking to us about water, assets, energy for lighting, which we don't have now, type of dwelling, when actually an analysis in the drivers of poverty in South Africa are clearly the level of unemployment, which has grown from 33% contribution to unemployment to poverty to 40% from 2001 to 2011, and grew to 52% between 2011 and 2016. The difference between 2011 and 2016 is 5 years. The difference between 2001 and 2011 is 10 years. In this period, this grew by 7 percentage points. In 5 years, it grew by 12 percentage points. It doubled in half the time. And here, the level of education as a contributor, or lack of thereof, as a contributor to poverty was at 15%, and it continued to drop up to 11%. Our problems of poverty, therefore, are anchored 63% in years of schooling and unemployment. Our politicians will be talking about energy, water, and this and that. So prioritization in terms of allocating resources appropriately is is no important as it is priority number 15. So politicians will be talking about this at that point. For the young people, the pressures are educational attainment, 35%. Over there in the multidimensional that I showed for society, it's 11%. The young people who are 15 to 24, they say education is number one. We are poor because we are uneducated. We are poor because there is no adult employed in the house. We are poor because we are not in employment or education and trade. And 66% of their poverty is explained by this. Only if policymakers can understand the plight that faces the youth would be far. Now, how have we performed? Almost monotonically from 2001 to 2011, poverty was reducing in all municipalities. From about 2011 to 2016, in a third of the municipalities, this has reversed. And indeed, when we start measuring in 2022 from the census of the Statistician General, we'll expect the worst. This is the picture of the state of the nation. Well, we'll hear what is presented by the president when he does in 2 days' time. Thank you very much.
Thanks for that, Pali. And you now understand why Pali was the former Statistician General, given the amount of stats that came through in that presentation. Janet, welcome to you. Janet Jobson is the Chief Executive Officer of the Tutu Legacy Foundation. Janet has had a very long career in activism. She's been with the DJ Murray Trust, Mandla Mobi, Amnesty International, Activate, Civicus, and African Girl Child Alliance. And Janet holds a BA honors degree in history at Rhodes University, and she was also a Mandela Rhodes Scholar. So welcome to you, and over to you for your input.
Thanks so much, Zakira, and it's lovely to be with everyone this evening. I really want to start my input by taking a step back and thinking about the South African population and the fact that 50% of our people are born frees. So 50% of people were not alive when South Africa voted for the first time. It puts into context, particularly some of what Pali shared, but I think it's helpful to think about the state of the nation in 3 time horizons: the 30 years, the last 15 years, and then the next 30 years. Over the last 30 years, and I maybe sound like a politician for saying this, we have seen extraordinarily positive movement on a few indicators, basic living conditions such as electricity, flushing toilets and formal dwellings. Now, the reason why I think it is important to emphasize these is that there is an amnesia about just how bad things were in 1994 when we started. So for instance, in 1996, only 58% of households had access to electricity. That's moved to 95% in 2022, although it comes and goes. 52% of people in 2001 had access to a flush toilet. That's now at 70%, far way off from where it should be, but a substantial increase. And in 1996, 65% of people had formal dwellings, lived in formal dwellings, and by 2022, that had changed to 89%. Now, I think it's very, very important that we understand the starting point of our democracy, because there is huge revisionism about the legacy of apartheid and quite where we started. We've also seen some really positive things, such as the implementation of social grants. They can be controversial, but all of the research I've read has shown very positive intergenerational effects, has shown that families use the grant well and that they have good outcomes for children. And then I think it is worth just noting, I was in a presentation this weekend with education economist Safas van der Berg, and he was pointing out that our education system seems to have improved on international benchmarks by what he called the speed limit. So by an amount that is in line with what one could expect, that if it had improved even more, it might be suspicious data. But if we look at the last 15 years, and I think Pali was making this point very strongly, particularly in that last graph, momentum has slowed or has completely stalled. And I think we're all very conscious that that is a combination of the results of corruption, lack of basic maintenance, poor governance, resource capture. I also want to mention the impact of COVID. I think it's very, very important that we remember that 300,000 people were killed by COVID-19, and those were largely older people in rural communities, which has a massive effect on the family and social dynamics of our society, particularly where young people are searching for work in urban areas and sending their children home to rural communities. We also know that COVID's had a huge impact on education. So although we've seen an improvement over time until before COVID, we're now looking at a loss of 10 years of progress. We're back at 2012 levels in international measures of progress on education. So what does losing momentum do to us? Well, I think we need to take into account the enormous psychological effect it has on us, that it really does shape how we then approach our society and how we approach our challenges. And so this psychological effect leads back into a very tangible effect. There's very interesting work done by two sociologists, Erin Wildavsky and Mary Douglas, who look at what shapes cultures of societies. And they point out that a fatalistic culture, which I think is indicative of South Africa, is driven by two major factors: socioeconomic polarization and constrained individual choice. Now, what we've seen, for instance, in the education story is although education is improving slowly, we have seen virtually no change to the inequality in the education system. So what does that mean? It means our quintile 5 schools, the top 20% of schools, are performing at a relatively good level. The rest of the 80% of our schools are underperforming. And it's not that there's a gradation, that quintile 4 is a bit better, quintile 3 a bit worse, quintile 2, and then quintile 1. All of those quintiles basically map onto each other as a single mass. And I think that's important to think about because so many families are spending time and effort and saving and scrimping to pay for transport fees for their kids, to pay for school fees for quintile 4 schools. And it's just not enough to get into that quality bracket of the quintile 5 schools. And sadly, this is a trend that we see playing out even before school starts. The latest evidence from early childhood is that by 5 or 6, these patterns of inequality are already mapped into our system. Income and wealth continues to be, we continue to have significant income and wealth inequality. And although the racial nature of the richest has changed somewhat, overall, we haven't seen a significant change in the racial makeup of access to wealth and to income. As Pali pointed out, half of young people are falling out of the economy. And it's really interesting to think about that particular moment when school ends, when your basic social structure, a daily routine, a daily community that you're part of suddenly disappears. And at the same time, the social grant that's been supporting you and your family disappears. So young people at age 18 to 22 are busy stepping into a society that's incredibly tough with virtually no support. What does this lead to? Well, we all know desperation and agitation. We know that we're a particularly violent society and that violence is rooted very much in the violence of our history and the brutality of apartheid. But it is also rooted in the everyday violence of our families and homes. In the Birth to 20 study in Soweto, 99% of children under the age of 18 had experienced violence in their community or their home. What does it mean for our soul as a nation that almost universally children are experiencing violence in some way, shape, or form? The level of fatalism we experience also leads to a real sense of persecution. During COVID, I helped to produce a daily multilingual radio show about the pandemic. And we had 200 people around the country sending us daily diaries to help us know what to put on the program. And it was fascinating to watch in the first few months how largely the young, unemployed, particularly Black people who were submitting these daily diaries felt that this virus was a conspiracy from government to kill them because they were a surplus people. And that sense of disconnection from society, that sense that you are so unwanted by society that your government might even kill you, I think is something we have to take particularly seriously if we want to understand the ways in which the psychology of our country plays into our violence and plays into the ways in which inequality persists. Well, what can we do about it? I obviously represent Archbishop Desmond Tutu's legacy. And one of the things I take mostly from him is this unbelievable, unbridled hope that things would change. You know, at the height of apartheid, he would stand in front of crowds and say, join the winning side. This is going to end. And I think we need that sense of absolute determination and hopefulness in order to move ourselves forward. Because despair and cynicism are maybe self-soothing postures, but they don't inspire action. And we've got to find the real momentum that inspires action. I love the quote from the Arch that says, to choose hope is to step firmly forward into the howling wind, bearing your chest against the elements, but knowing that this too will pass. So we've got to find a way to be hopeful. We've got to find a way to find each other across lines of continued economic, racial, and geographical division and polarization. It requires a common commitment to finding each other. We need to deal frankly and honestly with our failures as a society, with our woundedness as a society. And we need to do that in order to build a real resilience so that we can counteract the fatalism that has taken root in our society. We need to hold on to moments such as our current winning streak, but build that into the everyday relationships that shape our society. We have to model a new attitude, a new approach and approach to society in which we act with hope and we take that action across society to build a really strong, socially cohesive society that overcomes income inequality, that overcomes educational inequality. I'll leave it there for now, but let me leave it there.
Thanks, Janet. And I saw a piece you wrote based on the Archbishop's life where you say that finding light in the dark, and that's possibly where we need to look for hope. So thank you so much for that hopeful message at the end. I want to go back all the way to Iraj, because you had raised something quite important, speaking about our economy being broken. And you had mentioned that you think that there needs to be external factors that come in to help us rebuild our economy. So very quickly, do you think that this broken economy is the greatest threat to our democracy? And what do you suggest needs to happen to fix this economy?
Yeah, thank you very much. Without a doubt, an economy that is not performing means an economy that's not creating jobs, economy that's not creating the tax revenues, an economy that does not offer prospects for those who are capable to stay in. So a broken economy is a serious risk to democratic order. It is good for the autocrat, for dictators, and for all those who want to abuse the position, but it's not good for a social order which aspires to have a democratic dispensation driving life, prosperity, and future. So, and I mentioned that our economy is to a point that if you do it more of the same thing, the good old Einstein's view that you cannot solve the problems with the mindset that you've created, it really applies. At the moment, if I look at speeches that ministers make, solutions that they concentrate, and I bet, and you can hold me accountable to it, in 2 days' time, the president is going to give a State of the Nation that repeats the same type of policies that have caused this. And there will be hardly any revolutionary, urgent, sort of intentional departure from those policies, those ideologies, those actions and inactions that have caused this. So we need to get our economy right. It's not going to self-correct. Unfortunately, desperation psychologically leads to more desperation. In economic terms, low performance pushes the economy further down. So we need to sit back and really make a complete turn from some of these policies that remain responsible for the destruction of this economy, and be very specific. We cannot have state-owned enterprises run by the same mindset, populated by the same incompetence, and no accountability, and think that by just changing the guard, things will change. The same thing with departments, the same thing with some of the policies. So I think it's a serious situation for us, and the fact that much of the balance sheet of the country has been robbed, and we are not doing anything about it, means that the government either does not understand it or finds itself incapable of action. So as a society, I see we need to take the situation very, very seriously and rethink our options. Total reliance on an incompetent and indecisive government is asking for more troubles.
Thanks for that, Iraj. And we'll come back to the points you raised about corruption in a short bit. But I want to go to Pali because there's a couple of questions that are coming through in the chat. I think, Pali, there's a question about where you're getting your statistics, and maybe if you could just speak to where those stats are coming from. Secondly, there's a question around what does the 30% pass rate have to do with schools when you have the lowest quality of education? And that lowest quality of education, according to the person who's posing the question, comes from schools that would have been traditionally classified as African and colored. So I think maybe if you can speak to some of those racial dynamics, especially in the education sector, perhaps you want to expand on that. And then we'll come in with the follow-up questions that are posed to you as well. So over to you.
No, thank you very much. Well, I was the chief statistician. I wouldn't draw statistics from my head. They come from Statistics South Africa, and I've computed them all the time. And the censuses are usually the biggest time machines that tells you the historical. I could have shown how we all managed as a country to complete grade 3. All of us in South Africa now have acquired a grade 3 certificate. And when you move along the grades to grade 10, you see the colors and the blacks dropping behind the Indians and the whites. What we have in South Africa, which is we are missing the point, is that we have the 4-race model. And the 4-race model gives us some of the solutions that we have to deploy. If you look at the rate and speed of change that the Indians had from 1953, after Verwoerd said, what's the use of teaching Bantu child mathematics when it can't use it in practice? And started introducing the Bantu education. The Indians followed a different path from the colored and the blacks, with whom they were actually performing the same throughout. We have to go and look at what did the Indians do, and then execute that which the Indians did to get their education outcomes, almost surpass the white education outcomes. I mean, if you think about it today, the percentage of skilled blacks within their population group in 1994 was about 15–17%. That percentage has remained in that group up to this day. For those who are 15, for those who are 24 to 34, the skill level was about 17%. It has dropped to 14%. Now, compared to the Indians, who were hovering around 20% in 1994, they've moved to about 65% because of the kind of education they acquired. In the skills, whites have always been up there 40%, and with freedom, they ran up to 65% on average. That's why I was saying, if you look at Korea, you are actually looking at the Indian and the whites in South Africa. Now, 90% of the population on which we have to lean has meager skills, meager skills. They cannot transform this economy. And until people have understood these numbers and what they mean, that there's no Messiah will come from heaven to come and solve these problems. It is about policies. It is about how we act on those education policies. Now, at the 30% education pass and the maths literacy, the Indians and the whites don't go for maths literacy. I'm not condemning maths literacy because in a way, when we have done mathematics and maths literacy, you understand how the mathematics gets applied. But when you go and learn only maths literacy without understanding the mathematics, you can't understand how it gets applied. You have to do
Thanks.
both rather than the other one being an outlet. So there we are.
Thanks for that, Pali. And I think it goes to the slides that you shared about issues of unemployment and education being the driving factors behind the economic situation of the country, and possibly two issues that politicians need to respond to in this next period as they go about their manifesto and campaigning into different provinces as well. There are some questions coming through on the chat. I want to ask people who are posing questions and comments to refrain from racial generalizations that are there. But while we are on the topic of race, and I think it is an important issue given the state of inequality in the country at the moment, there's a question that has come through here, Janet, that there's been what do white South Africans do when Black South Africans are struggling with psychological and physical challenges? And it does go to the broader issue of reconciliation that the Tutu Foundation has been dealing with over this period. And perhaps the question that has enough been done 30 years into democracy to truly reconcile South Africa? Maybe you'd like to share some perspectives on that.
Yeah, sure. And I mean, the simple answer is no, we haven't done enough. I mean, I think one of the great disappointments of the TRC, for example, that we forget about is that it was set up out of a compromise to try and find a way to deal with the brutality of apartheid. And yet, when it came to the actual application of, for instance, applications for amnesty, of about 3,000 applications, only 290-ish came from the apartheid state. The rest came from liberation movements, from some other Afrikaner groups. But that tells us something very powerful about how little white people at the turn of democracy stepped into the reality of the country that they had created and the brutality that they had implemented. The failure there, though, was that our government then failed, our democratic government then failed to follow through on the recommendations of the TRC. So, for example, the TRC recommended 300 cases be prosecuted for crimes against humanity, for gross human rights violations under apartheid. Only one case has ever been successfully prosecuted. The NPA is now looking at a range of other cases. But it's worth thinking about how different our society would be and how differently we would feel about the process of reconciliation if we had had 300 trials, if we had really worked through the promise that the TRC had given us that people would be prosecuted, that we would find a way to hold accountable the brutality of apartheid. Similarly, the TRC had many interesting social recommendations, a wealth tax being one of them, which the Arch got a lot of flack for from white South Africans. But I think, again, most of this not implemented by government. And I think what we did was we decided that the 2 years of the TRC somehow was all we were going to do, rather than the ongoing work of healing and connectedness. I'm particularly, as a young-ish white South African, I'm particularly disappointed that I can't really point to a public white political leader who has brought white South Africans into conversation with and into relationship with Black South Africans in a way that really is about us being each other's keepers, that is really about us belonging to each other. So there's an enormous amount of psychological repair we still have to do, and the reconciliation work requires, firstly, that we keep on trying to find each other. I think it's very easy to give up on trying to find each other, and some of the frustration, particularly at the lack of progress from white South Africans, can lead us to disconnecting rather than stepping into connection. I think there needs to be a significant amount of conversation about what repair looks like. What does it look like for our communities to be repaired? How do we deal with the woundedness that we still carry, that is carried through multiple generations? And then I think we really have to reimagine who we can be together. We've got to find a way to paint a picture of a different society. And alongside that, to start to think about, as Pali was saying, what are the policies and ways of working that we can really reshape a society? So that's my little take on that.
Thanks for that, Janet. And there's a comment by Janine Ward in the chat that says that the reconciliation process should have been continued at community level. And I think there's great truth in that particular comment. We've covered, I think, in a nutshell, very broadly, the issues of education and now race relations in the country 30 years on from the dawn of democracy. I want to go back to Iraj and come back to what's likely to be a very important factor in this next election, and that's the issue of corruption. Just a couple of days ago, we've had the Corruption Perception Index come out saying that we are at an all-time low, a 12-year low, getting 43% out of 100. And we are ranked with some of, countries that haven't done very well in addressing issues of corruption. Where do you think we failed from the dawn of democracy to date? What are the failures in relation to addressing corruption? And where does that leave us in this next period going forward?
Thanks very much. I think where we failed is that we did not learn the lessons of history, meaning no country, be it emerging, be it developing, whatever label you use, they cannot protect themselves enough against corruption. I had the privilege back in 1997, 98, 99, to be advising the then Presidential Commission on Public Service. And one of the key issues, and that chapter is open for everybody to see, we raised it at that time and wrote extensively about protective measures that we need to take against corruption, and related to that is incompetence. Corruption and incompetence are two sides of the same coin. If you have incompetent people in charge, rest assured, in public or private sector, corruption will find a breathing space and will flourish. So that was the mistake that we done back in early 2000s. We were aware of it. The government certainly was talking about it at the top level, and yet all kinds of excuses were used not to put measures in place to stop it. And I don't have time to go to the history. I'm sure most of you are familiar with it. But the issue is that corruption started in the public sector, enabled by the private sector in all kinds of on all kinds of platforms. And over the past 10, 12 years, it reached its unbelievable height, where the public and public sector, corrupt and incompetent, they got into cahoot with big corporates, not a small business, not medium-sized businesses, but big corporates. And that is where they did the daylight plunder. And we need to, in my view, one of the solutions, I saw one of the friends asked what needs to be done to get us back on growth. However, and whatever our ideological position, today, unless South Africa recovers in a meaningful way, not in a notional and hand-waving way, meaningful way, the damage that's been inflicted by these corporates with the full support of some well-known political players, we have no hope of recovering from this low growth trap that our economy has been thrown into. I remember we were back in 2012, 2008, we were one of the top 3 emerging economies, growing at above 4.6%. We were an investment grade. We did not have a fraction of the cost of borrowing that we have today. And our treasury at that time was in surplus, not in deficit. You would all remember Minister Manuel coming year after year castigating his colleagues that why aren't you spending the money that you have for housing, for education, for health, etc., etc. So we have degenerated from that thanks to this collusion between or coalition of corrupt politicians and corrupt international corporates and some national corporates. So one of the solutions that we have to, as a nation, very quickly come to, now that we are armed with the Zondo report, is to not underestimate that corruption is lethal. As we speak, corruption has just mutated to a different format, but is happening with the same speed on different guises, because there has not been any accountability of those corporates who have been responsible. And even those who have settled have really done a joke. KPMG giving 23 million to SARS for the damage that they've caused is a joke. If that's the price to pay, all corporates that are left clean, they will continue doing corrupt behavior. And politicians who've got in, they're still sitting in the cabinet. There hasn't been any consequence. So that is the situation that we are. And the economy is in part handcuffed by its underpinning of public enterprises and the infrastructure being destroyed. And at the same time, having no consequence for destroying the economy, for stealing in the daylight in billions. Some of those fund managers are still in business. Some of those lawyers are still in business. Some of those corporates are still doing business, etc., etc. So I think we need to, as a nation, recognize that our government is compromised. And I'm not talking about party politics here. At political level, whatever shade and grade we choose, we need to have a national conversation about what is the right national requirement for the kind of compensation, the damage that has been done by both political leaders as well as by corporates. Then we will have the resources as a starting point. And let me just put a number here. We are not talking about billions. We are talking about over 2.5 trillion damage over the past 15 years to this economy, either stolen or as a result, we are now downgraded 2 degrees below junk status. We are gray listed, which means the country that does not have sufficient capability to prevent and deal with malfeasance and abuse of funds. That's what gray listing means. And that's the situation that we cannot leave to the government. They have been party to bringing it about, nor can we leave it to the technicians, technocrats, because the capacity of our public service has degenerated to the point that they allowed us to be gray listed. Remember, Minister Mboweni warned us 7 years ago that we are going to gray list it unless we do ABC. Nobody did anything. If you had competent people in the machinery of the state, they would not allow this to generate. And the cost to the unemployment, to the loss of GDP, loss of international rating is incalculable. We need to wake up.
Thanks for that, Iraj. There's quite a few questions coming in on the issue of corruption in cadre deployment, but we'll come to those in a bit. I want to go to Pali, who's recently written about what he terms 15 fat years in democracy and 15 lean years in democracy, very much like a kind of biblical description of the last 30 years. But Pali also describes the last 15 years as being anti-RDP, anti-NDP, that's National Development Plan, and anti-Constitution. And Pali, perhaps you want to expand on this. Do you think we will meet our National Development Plan goals in this next period, given the trajectory of the country?
Well, let me get back to where Jeanette was talking about the time points, about 1994 and 2022. I think by dealing with the period in that kind of manner, when looking at indicators, is doing a disservice. While the end point up to today, in terms of service delivery and so on, it's better than pre-94. But between those points, we knew better. So we need to say what happened between 1994 to 1999, 1999 to 2004, so that we can distinguish the points of inflection. Because when we understand the points of inflection, then we can say, where did we go wrong with our policy instruments? And that's where by 15 years of fat years and 15 years of lean years come from. Now, what we have seen compelled me to say that let's postpone an election. And in terms of postponing the election, one suggests that we have to come up with a People's Manifesto that discusses the aspiration of the people of South Africa to define what should be done in the future. Of course, there are constitutional matters, but a discussion like we are having today suggests to us that this election will be hollow because everybody is now talking about we want to win. And what does it mean to win? It means that the people are, in the words of John Gomomo, the voting cattle who will be deployed to make us win as politicians. There is a moral hazard, a serious moral hazard that we have. And I've equated this moral hazard to a jockey who has bought a horse and comes and parades his horse before us. And we as the public, what we have to do, only to applaud the jockey and the owner of the horse and the horse for running. To what end, we actually do not know. I agree with Iraj that we really have to go into that discussion of what is it that we need to have? What are the policies? How can we have line of foresight? What can we actually have foresight and proof of, future proof that the policies that we have put on the table actually mean something to us? In the indemnity scenarios, and I have to really talk about scenarios from the Montflair scenarios, the Montflair scenarios that were brought by Shell, that the government adopted in 1994, were about the flight of the flamingos, the Icarus, and the lame duck. The flight of the flamingos promised an inclusive democracy as well as an inclusive growth. Growth was not inclusive by end of 1999. But one has to agree that there were structures that were anchored in place. Democracy, if we talk about democracy being what you tick and say, I have the right to vote, then democracy was inclusive. But in the long term, as we see today, that democracy was not inclusive. The government changed gear and they went into what they call the memories of the future. And those memories of the future yielded what Iraj has been talking about. One of which was 6%. Debt to GDP ratio was when it was as down as low as 25% by 2007. Fixed capital formation, gross fixed capital formation was growing at double digit, about 20% annual compounded. Credit extension was at 15%. Now we got to go and look into those years and say, what happened in those years? Of course, Polokwane occurred in 2007, and something dramatically happened that was like a rupture in the same party that was governing. And since then, 2009, 2010, we have been heading downwards. And that is the analysis that we need to have. And we cannot be fooled by being told that between 94 to 2022, we have achieved the following things. No, there was a point of inflection that is very serious and downward looking from about 2011 to now. And that is what we have to arrest. And that's the discussion that we must have as a country to say, how do we deal with this downward spiral that struck from 2011 to the point where we are now, the 15 lean years? And how do we make sure that we turn this around? Thank you.
Thanks for that, Pali. Janet, I want to take a bit of what Iraj is saying and a bit of what Pali has been saying. So with Iraj's input, we looked at issues of corruption and perhaps the inability of government to implement the recommendations of the Zondo Commission. And similarly with Pali, there's I know some would disagree strongly with the assertion to want to postpone an election and rather conduct a people's manifesto, because ultimately the basis of a democracy or one of its fundamental pinpoints is that of an election. But surely there is a bigger role that society needs to be playing in terms of accountability. And as we go into this 2024 election period, I know the Tutu Foundation has been doing some work around the electoral period. What is it that civil society organizations and activists need to be doing? How do we ensure that all of these issues that are beginning to be raised in this discussion are put forward to political parties in a very honest and frank manner?
Yeah, I mean, I think it starts with the conversations in our society, and I think it's very, very helpful to have the very strong perspectives from Pali and Iraj, because it really places. I think this idea of the 15 lean years is really, really powerful, because it shows that there were choices we could make at certain points in our story, and that means we still have choices we can make now. I'm really conscious that I think we have very, very poor democratic and civic education in South Africa. I think most voters, when we speak about the elections, are thinking about who's going to win the election, when in reality it's a parliamentary election. We're voting for individuals to take up individual seats as members of parliament. Yes, there's party lists, but actually if we viewed parliament as 400 individuals who are making decisions, who are making policies, who are making legislation, and we can hold every single one of those 400 personally accountable, not just the parties, I think we would shift some of the dynamic that makes it feel like we're helpless as citizens of South Africa. I'm very, very passionate that we, I think delaying the elections or going into a process of a People's Manifesto is something we should do anyway. We should create a People's Manifesto. We should have a clear expectation of our government as to how it should perform. But I don't think that delaying the vote will get us anywhere closer to figuring out what is the particular constellation of government, the particular constellation of parliament that will help us get there. What we have to come back to is the understanding that we can make a choice, that we've made choices in the past, and some of those choices have been bad. The choices that have led to the 15 lean years have been incredibly bad choices, and we can make different choices. And so I think we need to do an enormous amount of voter education. We need to do an enormous amount of civic education to understand how our society is governed. And then we really need to find ways to find a way to feel like we truly belong to each other, that our futures, that our outcomes are fundamentally linked to each other. I think we can end up privatizing as much as we want to. At the end of the day, all of our fates are linked to each other, and we have to find a way to come together and pull in the same direction. And if we can do that as society and hold our government to account, then we can start to set the terms by which we expect to be governed. And I think we need to take that power back and say, how do we expect to be governed? What are the basics that we want to have in place as the people? And take that to the polls, but then take that further. There's a wonderful campaign in Nigeria called RSVP, register to vote, select who you're voting for, go cast your vote, but then protect your vote, protect the choice that you made by participating every day in democratic processes and in policy engagement. And I think that's a piece that's currently missing. There's lots of activity trying to get it going, but I think we have to increase significantly the amount that we engage with and feel power over our government.
Thanks for that, Janet. Iraj, coming back to you, there's been 2 questions in the chat related to cadre deployment. And one of the questions is, this is something that is some sort of without it being formally said, almost a kind of policy by the governing party. Although during the Zondo Commission, there was a lot of to and fro about whether that was the case or it wasn't the case. But there's a question there that says that it's one of the root causes of corruption. And is there a way that the population of this country can try and put a stop to it? Is it possible?
I think the stop takes much of, not all, much of this debate is really a racial assumption that that Black equals incompetence. The reality is that between 1994 to 2002, those who were in charge of policy were Blacks. Those who turned the economy from less than 1% to 5.5%, 5.8%, which was the peak of our growth in 2001, 2002, they were all Black. Pali was the Statistician General, is black. He's excelled since then, and I can name so many of the DGs and the DDGs, and they're a matter of history. So I think we need to separate the race from competency. We need to place incredible, open, transparent value on merit and capability. And if KD employment means choosing people who are competent, and we've shown that it worked, then that should be the criteria. So I think we need to go from cadre development to criteria for appointment. You cannot have people who assume DG-ship or DDG or chief director without experience, without adequate experience, without relevant policy bona fide. So that's where the debate should be. And in my view, going back to Janet, we need to find solutions that brings us together and not hop on a particular thing that smells of and is laden with racism and prejudice. So I believe it is big lessons that we've learned, that whether it's in the name of cadre development, whether it's in the name of racial equalization or other equalization, the minute that we compromise on competency and we put an incompetent pilot in charge of a 747, that plane will collapse. And we have seen it. The South African economy was a flying 747, figuratively speaking. It became, within a shortest period of time, between 1995 to 2001, we went from an economy that was unrateable to an investment grade rated. The first of emerging economy to that. And that was done under the leadership of black political leadership, black technical leadership. So we must separate these two things. If you put an incompetent white, is as bad as an incompetent black. So this is a big lesson that I think as a society we need to demand. If there is a manifesto, it means I do not want anybody to run the hospital who doesn't know what the hospital should be run like, white or black. A school needs competency in running the schools, infrastructure requires, and luckily, at the moment, after 30 years, despite all our failures, we have created a layer, unfortunately a thin layer, but a layer of very competent and experienced black professionals. But we need to allow them, not corrupt them, because they will not compromise. They will run away if you want to corrupt them. So I think we need to change the conversation, in my view, learning from the horrible mistakes that we've made at a huge expense to the black majority population, young and old, and reset the terms of engagement, the reset, and also reset the language. These are the liberators, the leaders. The majority of them who are at the moment in charge, they do not qualify to be leaders. They can't even lead themselves. They cannot lead their moral campus. They don't want to lead the rest of us. Forget about it. So I think we need to, as a society, learn from our mistakes, have a different discussion, discourse, and not focus on racial differences, because that is a divisive wedge that will be used by corporates who are corrupt and politicians who are corrupt.
Thanks, Iraj. While you're still on, there's one more question that I think has come up, and that's really the role of the private sector. So we know the private sector holds on to a huge surplus of money in this country. And there's one of the questions in the chat relates to it. But similarly, much will be said, and this is really in anticipation of what the president may be speaking about in his SONA in the next 2 days, about the relationship between business and government and the strides that have been made in relation to logistics. So, the moving of mining material via our roads and then Transnet and out of our ports. Similarly, in terms of combating crime and corruption. And lastly, in terms of energy and load shedding and addressing the issues there. Just to get your assessment, is this a relationship that's working for the country? What has been the pros and cons of it?
No, I think that the reality is that, and no business, at least corporates, would deny that they are sitting on investable funds that they cannot invest. Remember, the private sector business, and I'm one of them, at the nano level. Every day, your mission is to go and find more opportunities for growth, more opportunities for investment. Capital doesn't go to work and say, well, how am I going to hold? Any capitalist who sits on money is not a capitalist, is a failed capitalist. Any businessman who sits on cash on a balance sheet or ability to leverage his balance sheet and doesn't use it productively is a failed leader, CEO, etc., etc. So why aren't they investing? That should be the question. I'm asking those who are very skeptical. How would you spend when you cannot get water license if you want to do farming? You cannot have transportation if you are into logistics or cargo import export. Your ports are in an absolute mess. Your railway, where would you invest? How can you invest? You cannot get mining license. And the Minister of Mines cannot explain when and how and why in the 21st century, in the fourth industrial revolution age. Other countries are doing it 2.5 hours. 2.5 hours, you're either yes or no. And it's transparent. It's on a screen why you don't qualify and why you do qualify. We're getting 10 years waiting. How do you invest your capital? Let's just again not create false dichotomies and create more tension, which is based on ignorance. Show me one capitalist in this country, black or white or anything else, foreign or local, who is not complaining about the fact that they cannot invest their money. Why? Because some or other government, municipality or department is sitting on license, or some or other infrastructure has been destroyed. I do not have time, and I'm really mindful of but this is a false assumption, false discourse that we are having. We're creating those who have to put their money at risk and create jobs and growth. We are frightening them for no good reason. They are on our side, not on the opposite side. Government has to let go of this self-perception that they are in charge. They can destroy, they cannot build. And therefore, a discourse, a relationship between the private and public sector needs to change. The capacity to invest, the capacity to bring technology, the capacity to bring best global competitive practice does not rest in government departments. With no politician, whether they are populist, socialist, capitalist, they are useless. Therefore, they need to admit that. They must collaborate with public sector. They need to be open about it, because this collaboration, if it's not open and transparent, it will lead to corruption of the type that we've seen. So this is a very, very fine policy that we should get. We talk about partnership, PPPs and so on, which is important, but unless it's done transparently with a massive civil society oversight, with binding accountable measures in it, we're going to have another mutation of corrupt partnership between these two sectors. So I think there's a lot of opportunities, lessons that we've learned, but India is doing it. Other countries have done it. They've learned their lessons. Those lessons have been refined. Instead of reinventing the wheel and paying another price for failed attempts, we need to look out the window, successful economies, successful societies that have hammered out a workable, transparent, and productive win-win situation. That's what we desperately need.
Thanks for that, Iraj. And I'm mindful of time as well. So I'm going to ask Pali to come in. Pali, you've spoken about the need for some sort of a people's manifesto that puts people's needs above that perhaps of the political parties. Going into this next election period, there's great speculation that the post-2024 election period will give us a number of coalitions at a provincial level and potentially at a national level as well. In light of the possibilities of coalition governance in this country, what would be your vision for the country? How do you think that political parties need to manage these coalitions to perhaps achieve this vision, perhaps for the next 30 years going forward?
Okay, not when every political party comes in like a jockey with his own horse. What's going to happen is an exchange of jockeys and horses in that government. There is no policy statement that South Africa has around these issues that we are talking about. In the absence of that, you can expect a mess in these coalitions. Let me step back and say we do not, as South Africa, have spaces that are organic where we can talk amongst ourselves as blacks, white, and colors. Nowhere. When Bafana Bafana comes, of course, our streets will be full, happy with Bafana Bafana as we did with Box. But after that, that's the end. What we did, which is very wrong, we forgot that 1976 was the year of the student. And years before then, in the 60s, Thabo Mbeki and others were those students who were at the vanguard, Steve Biko and others. Now, at university level, when students said fees must fall, we went in there stupidly as policymakers to separate the students around fees must fall. It is the only space where you have adequate quantities of blacks, coloreds, and Indians and whites. And they said fees must fall. A government that is sensitive to this kinds of messages and nation building would have said fees must fall for everyone. You students have to define what the future is. That opportunity still exists now. Now, a number of years later, 2020, when COVID struck, business came to government and said, government, we have this problem. Here is a basket of 1,000 sheets of paper that they wrote. And they said, here are the targets we can achieve as a nation. We can achieve a 6% growth. We can reduce unemployment to 15%. We can reduce debt to GDP ratio to 60%. We can actually have a winning nation. Unemployment will reduce to about 12%, they said, 14%, they said. Now, when the private sector comes to you as government and says that, you really have to say, I hold you to the targets. But what happened? The private sector was not listened to. And 2 years later, they came back again, now with a deeper crisis of telecom, of Eskom, of crime, and of transport and logistics. Now, the targets that bother us of poverty, inequality, and unemployment have gone out of the window, things that can unite us. Now, private sector is going to pick the winners. We have created a monster for ourselves going forward. So what we need is to go back to what business had asked for in 2020 and said, we want these targets. And once we work with those targets of lesser unemployment, better growth, less inequality, and all those, if we go back to those, we can begin the journey of nation building. We got to bring business to that ask that they made in 2020. Otherwise, we are actually off the rail. And that business has to do with government and civil society to focus on those targets. By the way, in a modeled process of applied development research, those targets that business came with are a spitting distance from a modeled process that have looked at the motions of economy. And those targets are actually achievable. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for that, Pali. Janet, coming back to you, right? Do you think, your honest critique, that the country today is reflective of the aspirations that people had when they stood in the queues in 1994? And if not, why do you think so?
Sure, it's a big question. I think, I mean, obviously it's not. It's not what people had. I mean, I was too young. I was 10 years old in 94. We have not become what we could have become. And I think part of what I was trying to speak about in terms of this fatalistic culture that we have is that I think we've given up on the work of the ongoing struggle to reimagine who we can be. I mean, I love the way that Iraj and Pali speak about the power of competence, the power of collective action in a society. And I think that we've really, one of the real downsides of moving into a democratic government where so many people who'd mobilized in civil society moved into government is that it almost became the idea that government would solve all our problems, that was the only site for transformation. And when you don't then have competence and you don't necessarily have people who are following through in the ways that they could, that's where we see a real breaking down of the institutions of our society. I think we have the opportunity to reimagine who we can be together. I think we have the opportunity to put forward a real vision for who we can be. And I think some of it lies in the expertise and the comments that Pali and Iraj have made. And a lot of it relies on sort of the deep heart that we each bring to it. I see Pali wearing the Bafana shirt, and I think here we are in the semi-finals. Maybe we always had this potential, and yet we weren't finding a way to unleash it in the past in our Bafana team. And similarly, I think as a society, we have enormous potential. We have a really powerful set of building blocks. We have at least some institutions that remain intact, although many have been broken and need to be rebuilt. And we've got to work from that place into an incredibly positive vision of who we can be together and how we can define our society. And I think the only way we can do that is by taking our vote incredibly seriously, but then taking it so seriously that the very next day we step up to continue the engagement, to continue the work of accountability, and to continue setting a new vision for society.
Thanks for that, Janet. I'm going to ask each of you one last question just to round up this discussion. And thereafter, everyone else on the call, please do remain on, because we have a short presentation around the Defend Our Democracy's Election Watch campaign. But the question on everyone's lips in a lead up to 2024 is who you're going to vote for. Obviously, I'm not asking you to share that information here, but in 30 seconds, can you perhaps share one or two criteria that you'd be using or you would advise people to use when they go to the polls? Should they be voting on the basis of what they feel, or should they be voting on the basis of logic? Should they be voting on the basis of both? So what do you think should be the one or two main points or main criteria used to evaluate political parties as well as political candidates in this next period? Iraj, and then we'll take Pali and Janet thereafter.
Yeah, obviously, as you would have gathered, for me, I would like to focus on competence. If they do not put a group of competent people as their nominees, I'll run away from them, whether they are black or white. They are betraying the national project, as we discussed. The national project is bring to the nation, learn from our mistakes, and make a complete, not U-turn, change the game. Because we can't do a U-turn. We need to change the game, refocus, and I will look at people who are nominated and their level of competence, not their promises, not their manifesto. All of that is hot air.
Thanks for that, Iraj. Pali?
There are 3 E's that I'm looking for. And I must distinguish or at least explain the first E, which is education. And education is not speaking English, but education in terms of competence, of technical competence and ability. And that education must be etched in empathy and ethics. Only when it is etched in that, then I can vote for someone. And if they bring ethics and empathy, I would still vote for such a person, because education or technically, you can always buy in to get in there. But you have to be sure that you bring those who are much more educated than you are, and then you can manage them ethically and with empathy. Those are the 3 things that I would be looking at, the 3 E's, where education is a unification of empathy and ethics. And then, of course, the technical ability.
Thanks for that, Pali, with the 3 E's. Janet?
Can I steal both Iraj and Pali's answers? I think it's a great combination of competence. I love empathy and ethics. I mean, I think the one thing I carry with me when I go into the voting booth is the reminder that I'm voting for a seat in Parliament. And so for me, often the way that I approach voting in national elections is to really ask myself, whose voice do I want in Parliament? Whose voice do I want contributing to the debates on my behalf? I really think that we have to ensure that we don't get sucked in by the promises of particularly populism, where we're seeing the troubles of South Africa blamed on others, blamed on migrants, blamed on anyone else. We've got to find a way to vote for parties that really take responsibility, that really step up And I love that empathy and ethics at the heart of everything they do.
Thanks for that, Janet. I just want to thank our three panelists here. I hope that their perspectives will give you some sort of insight going into this next period, both in terms of the 2024 elections, but also in 2 days' time when the president delivers the State of the Nation address. And hopefully we can critically reflect on what comes out of that address. This year is the 30th year of democracy. And I think that the vision that's being painted here by Pali, Iraj, and Janet needs to inform perhaps the work that citizens, business, labor, and those in government who are committed to, I think, a good vision and a positive vision and an ethical vision for this country can commit to, and something that we need to build towards in the next 30 years. That being said, Defend Our Democracy called for 2024 last year at the UDF celebrations to be the year of the active citizen. And it's always difficult to anticipate or to decide how to be an active citizen in an election year when political parties are doing the most to try and get everyone's votes. But I'm going to call on Sonto Magwaza, who's the campaign manager for Election Watch, and this is a campaign of Defend Our Democracy, to just share how you can be an active citizen in this year. So please do indulge us with your time. We're asking just for 10 minutes or so more to hear this presentation, and then we'll call it a night. Sonto, over to you.
Thank you so much, Zakira, and thank you so much to our panelists. That was quite enriching inputs. As we've all heard from our panelists, that we are in 30 years in democracy, but things have not changed. Things are still the same. I'm just picking up on a few issues that were raised around issues of unemployment and also education, and also the battling issues around race. So I think this leads us to ask questions as to what should be the role of political parties during this time. And as DOD, we're wondering, as we are observing the emerging conversations around elections now, as we approach the elections and awaiting a date for announcement, seeing that there are debates and also issues that are raised by political parties around rigging of elections and so forth, instilling doubt in terms of our democratic processes. But I think as DOD, we're wanting to insist as an organization on the approach that perhaps one of the things that could begin to bring us together as a nation, as a country, to have conversations about how do we want to look like, what is it that we want to see emerging in terms of our economies, in terms of economic justice, in terms of policies that are drafted, and how our education should look like, is perhaps the start is to begin to get back into participating in the democratic processes, and one of which is really being part of observing the elections. So one of the key things that we think are important to note is that the importance of this campaign is really to ensure that we have people from the grassroots level participating and getting involved in observing elections, to also believe again in our democratic processes. 2024 is for many people in South Africa is really a hope of ensuring that they get to elect or get to have a choice to elect what they would want to see. Perhaps that what is most of the people are thinking, as we've seen the increase in terms of the voter registration over the weekend and so forth. And also, I think the important thing to note as well is that the frustrations that have really emerged in many communities around issues of corruption, state capture, as it has been stated by the previous speakers, are issues that are driving the nation really into chaos. One of the big things around unemployment that is affecting even young people is really the issue of not being able to understand also, as Janet was saying, around issues of voter education as to when I am voting, what is it that is really that I am ready to. So with Election Watch, we are really calling upon organizations, civil society organizations, to be active participants in ensuring that we firstly are active and also observing elections in 2024. I just want to go through some of the key events that Election Watch will be going to embark on in the coming months towards elections. Just to note that in the past weekend, during the voter registration weekend, we've had a very successful piloting of the app that we tested with our volunteers. The intention of the app really is to ensure that during the voting processes, we capture and we get reports across the country in terms of what is the situation look like, and also if the elections are going the right way, and if there are any incidents of violence that gets reported immediately. So this will really ensure and bring some sort of stability and ensure that there is integrity in our election processes. So the past weekend, we really tested an app which will help us do so if we have volunteers from your organization to participate in these processes. We had about 50 to 80 volunteers participating across South Africa, and they really were excited and observed that we had a peaceful registration weekend. We're anticipating that we would have around 5,000 towards elections, and also at least 2,005 organizations participating in the Election Watch. And over and above that, we are going to have provincial meetings where we're going to be continuing with our call for organizations ready to participate as observers to ensure that we are posted in all the key areas and the hotspots in the country, ensuring that there's presence and there's observation and also there's harmony in the election process. These events are going to be taking place between 9 and 28th. Please watch out on our website for key events. We're starting in Northwest, Limpopo, and in Mpumalanga and Free State, where we're going to have a meeting on a full day meeting. And in KZN, I think we'll have a 2-day meeting where we will be raising these issues with civil society organizations, having conversations on how we really would like South Africa to look like. And furthermore, to have an understanding that we would have some trainings for the observers to ensure that they understand what they're expected to do in terms of the election day. But most importantly, to also open up conversations around what is it that really for people in the grassroots, it will look like to have elections that are peaceful, but also what does the future look like for them? What is it that they would really want to see changing in their country? So the call for registration to all organizations will end by the second week of April, anticipating that elections will happen in May, if so. But what we're calling for is organizations to log into our website, and when they log into our website, they will then, on the slide number 4, we have the guys that will lead organization to ensure that they are registered in our portal. Just make sure that your organization has all its registration documents, registration docs, so that they are uploaded on our system. I think on the chest, there should be a link that links you directly to our website for you to be able to register and load your organization if you want to participate and be an active observer during our elections. Purely for our campaign really is promoting that we observe democratic processes and we are participants in these processes in our country. But most importantly is also to begin to raise a very rooted grassroots kind of conversations around what does democracy look like for an ordinary person, and what does also participating in voting means as well. So we're hoping that by the end of this campaign, we would have built networks and also civil society organizations that were able to connect in terms of having further conversation and building towards a possible kind of conversations on what should we really be doing in the absence of elections. Can we have continued conversations with regards to, electoral reform and other processes within the country? I think that's where I will stop. If Sakira, if there are any questions, we could allow. I'm just mindful of time at this point. And thank you for the time.
Thanks for that, Sonto. So there you have it. This is a politically non-partisan campaign for this year leading into elections, where we're really calling on organizations. And even if you're an individual, to register on Election Watch, join us on election day to monitor elections and collectively, through a collective system, help to pronounce on the integrity of the elections. We'll be having a series of training sessions in this next period, but we are really appealing to organizations to join us collectively in this campaign. That being said, I know quite a few people need to leave, so we will call it a day. And just to thank Reverend Moss, the panelists, Nomasonto, for your presentations and inputs. And hopefully we can continue this conversation. There was so much that had come through on the chat that we weren't able to tackle. But I think leading up to the 2024 elections, there would be other platforms where we can continue the conversation. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and we hope to see you at the next session.
Thank you.